The days had turned into months, and Clara had come to realize something. Her life was no longer the one she had imagined when she first arrived. The ranch was thriving, and so was she. She had learned to handle the animals, manage the land, and keep everything running smoothly. The sense of loneliness she had once felt on the ranch had started to fade, replaced by a quiet contentment. She had done what she came here to do, and more. She had built a life for herself. It was a calm morning when Clara stood on the porch of her cabin, looking out at the land that had become so familiar to her. The sun was rising, casting its golden light over the fields, and the breeze carried the sweet scent of the fresh earth. The cattle were grazing peacefully, and everything felt right in the world. There was still work to be done, of course, but Clara didn't feel overwhelmed anymore. She had grown stronger, and the ranch was now a reflection of her hard work. But as content as she felt, there was a part of Clara that still wondered what would come next. She had built this life for herself, but was she truly happy? For all the progress she had made, there was something missing. It wasn't just the work or the isolation. It was the quiet, gentle longing in her heart that hadn't gone away. A longing for something more. And that something, Clara realized, was love. She had grown fond of Lucas. At first it had been just a friendship, a connection that had helped ease the loneliness she had felt. But over time she had come to see him in a different light. His visits had become more frequent, and the time they spent together had become more meaningful. They had shared so many moments, working side by side on the ranch, talking about their pasts, laughing at small jokes and finding comfort in each other's company. Clara had tried to deny it at first. She had come to the West to start over, not to fall in love. She wasn't sure she was ready for a relationship, and she certainly didn't want to complicate things. But as the months passed, the feelings she had for Lucas grew stronger. She admired his strength, his quiet confidence, and the way he made everything seem possible. When he was around, she didn't feel so alone. He made her feel like she was part of something bigger, something more than just a lonely woman working a ranch on her own. One evening, as the sun began to set, Clara and Lucas were sitting on the porch enjoying the warmth of the fading light. They had just finished a long day of work, and the peaceful silence of the evening seemed to settle around them like a soft blanket. The only sounds were the distant calls of the birds and the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees. "You've come a long way," Lucas said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but there was a hint of pride in it. "This place, it's more than I imagined it could be." Clara smiled, looking out at the land. "It's a good place. It wasn't always this way, but I've worked hard to make it what it is. It feels like it's mine now." "It is yours," Lucas replied, his gaze turning toward her. "You've made it yours." For a long moment the two of them sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet tension between them. There was so much they had shared over the past few months, so much they had been through together. But there was something unsaid between them, something that Clara had been too afraid to face. Finally, Clara turned to Lucas. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what to do with all of this. I've built this life, and it's exactly what I wanted. But sometimes it feels like there's something missing. I don't want to be alone forever." Lucas looked at her, his expression serious. "You don't have to be alone, Clara." Clara's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had known, deep down, that this was the moment when things could change, when the life she had built for herself could become something even more. But she had always been so cautious, so afraid of losing everything she had worked for. "I've never really allowed myself to think about it," Clara confessed. "I've been so focused on this ranch, on making it work, that I didn't want to let anything else get in the way. But now, I feel like I can't ignore it anymore." Lucas reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a rush of emotions through her, and for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to be vulnerable. She didn't have to be strong all the time. She didn't have to keep everything together on her own. "You don't have to ignore it," Lucas said, his voice gentle. We've both been through a lot, but we don't have to go through it alone. We can build something together." Clara felt a lump form in her throat, and she couldn't help but smile through the tears that threatened to well up in her eyes. It was the first time she had allowed herself to think about a future that wasn't just about survival, about work. It was a future that could be shared, a future with someone who understood her in a way that no one else ever had. "I don't know what the future holds," Clara said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I know that I don't want to face it alone anymore. I want to face it with you." Lucas smiled, his eyes soft and full of understanding. "You don't have to be alone, Clara. I'm right here." As the sun set behind them, casting a soft golden light over the ranch, Clara realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It wasn't just about building a life alone in the West. It was about finding love, about sharing her life with someone who truly cared for her. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Lucas spent even more time together. They worked side by side on the ranch, but now there was something deeper between them, an unspoken bond that grew stronger with each passing day. They shared their dreams, their hopes, and their fears. The ranch was no longer just a place for Clara to escape to. It was a place where she had built a future she could now share with someone who would be there for her, just as she would be there for him. Clara had come to the West to start over, to escape her past and find a new life. But what she had found was something far greater: love, partnership, and the promise of a future filled with hope. She had taken on the challenge of running a ranch alone, but in doing so, she had discovered that she didn't have to do it all by herself. There was someone who cared, someone who would stand beside her no matter what. As Clara stood on the porch that evening, watching the stars begin to fill the sky, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Clara knew she wasn't facing it alone, and that made all the difference. As the weeks passed, Clara settled into the rhythm of ranch life. The days were long and the work was grueling, but there was a sense of accomplishment that filled her each evening as she sat down for a meal. She had learned so much in such a short time: how to mend fences, care for the cattle, and even handle the unpredictable weather that could turn the ranch into a challenge. Every day felt like a small victory, and that kept her going. Despite the improvements she had made, Clara knew there was still much to be done. The barn was now in better condition, the animals were thriving, and the land was starting to look more manageable. But there were still areas that needed attention. The irrigation system needed repair, and the pastures still required careful tending to ensure the cattle had enough to graze. The more she worked, the more she realized just how big of a task she had taken on. But Clara was not one to shy away from hard work. She spent every morning out with the cattle, ensuring they had enough water and feed, checking the fences and walking the land to make sure nothing was out of place. As the days turned into weeks, the ranch began to feel like hers. She had poured herself into this life, and in return, it was starting to yield small rewards. One of the most challenging parts of Clara's new life was the isolation. While she had begun to earn respect from the locals, the work on the ranch still required most of her time. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and although she had made a few friends in the town, the distance made it hard to build strong connections. There were days when the silence of the ranch was overwhelming, and Clara would find herself longing for the companionship of someone who understood what she was going through. On one such day, as Clara was mending a fence near the creek, she heard the familiar sound of hooves in the distance. She paused, wiping the sweat from her brow, and looked up. There, riding towards her, was Lucas Hunt, a rancher from a nearby property. He was a tall man, with a rugged look that suggested years of hard work and determination. Lucas had been watching Clara from afar ever since she had taken over the ranch. Unlike some of the other ranchers, he didn't seem to doubt her abilities. He respected her for the way she had handled the challenges she faced on her own. "Looks like you're making good progress," Lucas called out as he rode up to her. His voice was calm and there was a friendly smile on his face. Clara straightened up, brushing dirt off her hands. "I'm trying," she said, a small laugh escaping her lips. "There's always something to do around here." Lucas dismounted and walked over to her, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He glanced at the fence she was repairing and nodded. "You're doing a good job. Not many women would take on a ranch like this, especially after losing a husband they never met." Clara felt a twinge of sadness at his words. She had never known James, but his death had brought her here, and she felt a deep sense of responsibility toward his ranch. "I didn't come here expecting to take over everything," she said quietly. "But now that I'm here, I feel like it's something I need to do." Lucas regarded her with a thoughtful expression. "You've got a lot of heart, Clara. That's something not many people have." For a moment, the two stood in silence, each absorbed in their thoughts. Clara appreciated Lucas's presence. It wasn't often that she had someone to talk to about the ranch and the challenges she faced. Even though the town was small, there were few people who truly understood what it took to run a ranch. Most of them had never had to take on the kind of work Clara was doing, and the ones who did were often too busy with their own affairs to offer much help. "Well, I was going to offer you some help with the irrigation system," Lucas said, breaking the silence. "I noticed it needs some work. If you'd like, I can come by and show you how to fix it." Clara hesitated for a moment. She was used to doing everything herself, but the thought of having someone to teach her something new was tempting. She had spent so many nights studying books and trying to learn on her own that it would be nice to have someone guide her. "I'd appreciate that," Clara said, her voice soft. "I've been meaning to get to it, but I've had so much on my plate already." "It would be good to learn from someone who knows what they're doing," Lucas smiled. "I'll come by tomorrow morning then. We'll get it sorted out." The next morning, Lucas arrived early, his horse trotting behind him. Clara had been up before dawn preparing for the day's work, but she welcomed the distraction. She had learned a lot about ranching on her own, but Lucas had experience that would help her tackle the problems that still lingered. They spent the morning working on the irrigation system, and Clara found herself grateful for his knowledge. It wasn't just the work that felt easier. It was the way Lucas explained things with patience, never making her feel foolish for not knowing something. As they worked, the conversation shifted to other things. Clara found herself telling Lucas more about her life in the East, about the struggles she had faced before coming to the West. Lucas shared his own story, how he had come to the area to work with his father on their family ranch, how things had been hard at first, but how he had slowly built up his land and business. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Lucas said as they finished up the irrigation repairs. "I can see why you've made this work. It's not easy, but you've stuck with it." Clara smiled, grateful for his words. "It hasn't been easy, that's for sure. But I'm not one to give up." Lucas paused, looking at her for a long moment. "I can tell." From that day on, Lucas began visiting the ranch more frequently. He wasn't always there to help, but his presence was a comfort to Clara. He was a quiet, steady man, and there was something about him that made Clara feel less alone. They would often sit together on the porch after a long day's work, sharing a cup of coffee or just enjoying the silence. Over time, their friendship grew stronger, and Clara started to realize that maybe she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. But despite the growing connection between them, Clara still kept her guard up. She had come to the West to escape her past, not to find a new man. She wasn't sure what she wanted from Lucas or if she was even ready for a relationship. All she knew was that she enjoyed his company, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had found someone who understood the challenges she faced. As the weeks went by, the ranch continued to thrive. The cattle were doing well, and the repairs around the property were slowly but steadily being completed. Clara had learned to trust herself, to trust in the decisions she made for the ranch. There were still many obstacles ahead, but Clara was no longer the uncertain woman who had arrived weeks ago. She was stronger, more confident, and ready to face whatever the future held. But there was one thing Clara wasn't prepared for: how her feelings for Lucas would begin to change. She had never expected to find herself feeling anything more than friendship for him. But as they spent more time together, she began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was more to their connection than she had first thought. Clara woke up early the next morning with a sense of determination she hadn't felt before. The events of the previous day, the funeral, the heavy words from Mr. Langley, had left her feeling lost and unsure. But something deep inside her was telling her that she couldn't just walk away. The ranch was hers now, and it was time to face the reality of what that meant. She stood by the window of the small cabin, looking out over the land that stretched out before her. The sky was wide and open, and the rising sun painted the landscape in soft shades of pink and orange. The ranch was beautiful, almost breathtaking in its quiet solitude. But Clara knew that beauty alone wouldn't make it thrive. She had a lot of work ahead of her, and she had no idea where to start. The morning air was crisp and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was peaceful. As Clara stepped outside, she took a deep breath. The world seemed endless here, with no signs of the life she had once known. The town was small and people were scattered across the vast land, but she felt the weight of this new life pressing on her shoulders. She had come to the West to escape her past, but now she found herself standing at the edge of a completely new kind of challenge. Clara walked down the dusty path toward the barn, her boots kicking up small clouds of dirt with each step. The barn was old, worn, but still standing tall. She could hear the faint sounds of the animals inside, the low moo of a cow, the clinking of hooves against the wooden floor. It wasn't much, but it was hers now, and she would make it work. The first thing Clara did was inspect the barn. She ran her hands along the weathered wood, feeling the roughness of the structure. It wasn't in terrible condition, but it was clear that James had been struggling to keep it together. The barn was full of hay, equipment, and some old, unused tools. Clara took inventory of what she had and what she needed. There was a small supply of feed for the cattle, but she would need more. There was some fencing, but it looked worn and in need of repair. The land had potential, but it needed care, and Clara knew that she was the only one who could provide it. Over the next few days, Clara threw herself into work. She spent long hours in the barn, cleaning out the stalls, feeding the cattle, and learning about the different tasks that would need to be done. At first, it was overwhelming. She had no experience in ranching, and the work was hard. Every task seemed to lead to another, and by the end of the day, she was exhausted, her muscles aching, but somehow satisfied with the progress she had made. Clara's determination was her strength, but she couldn't do it all alone. The work was too much for one person, especially someone with no experience. That was when she began to reach out to the people in the town. She had heard that some of the local ranchers, including Mr. Langley, had been kind to James in the past, and she hoped they might be willing to lend a hand. It wasn't long before she met Tom, a local rancher who had known James for years. Tom was a tall man with broad shoulders, his face weathered from years of working in the sun. When Clara approached him, she wasn't sure how he would react, but to her surprise, Tom didn't hesitate. He could see the determination in her eyes, and although he was skeptical at first, he agreed to give her a hand. Running a ranch isn't easy, Tom warned her as they walked across the fields together. You've got to be tough. There are days when you'll feel like giving up, but if you stick with it, you can make something of this place. Clara nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had already seen how hard the work could be. The cattle, the land, the buildings, everything required care, and she wasn't sure if she could keep up with the demands. But there was something inside her that wouldn't let her quit. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to give up now. Over the next few weeks, Tom taught Clara the basics of ranching. He showed her how to mend fences, how to care for the animals, and how to keep the ranch running smoothly. It wasn't easy, but Clara soaked in every bit of information he gave her. Slowly, the land began to take shape. She repaired the fences, cleaned out the barns, and worked on the fields. The more she worked, the more she began to understand the rhythms of ranch life. It was tough, but there was a certain beauty in the simplicity of it all. Clara also started to make a name for herself in the town. At first, people had looked at her with pity, thinking she was just another woman who had come west and would soon turn back when the going got tough. But as the weeks went by, they began to see her determination. She was working hard, learning fast, and showing that she wasn't just some naive woman who didn't know what she was doing. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara sat on the porch of her cabin, looking out at the stars. The wind had picked up, and the sound of the trees swaying in the breeze was calming. She was exhausted, but there was a deep sense of satisfaction in her heart. The ranch was beginning to show signs of life again, and she could feel a connection to the land that she had never felt before. That night, as Clara sat in the quiet, she thought about the future. The challenges weren't over. There was still so much to learn, so much to do. But for the first time since she had arrived, Clara felt a sense of hope. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. The following day, as Clara was working on the fields, she noticed Bart Weller, a neighboring rancher, watching her from across the fence. Bart was a tall, stern man known for his successful ranch and his sometimes harsh opinions. Clara had heard whispers about him in town, how he didn't believe women could handle ranching and how he often made snide remarks about those who tried. She had heard that he thought she wouldn't last long, but Clara wasn't going to let that stop her. Bart called out to her, his voice carrying across the wind. "You know, you'll never make it if you keep working like that," he said. His tone was dismissive, as though he didn't believe she had the strength to succeed. "This is real work, not something you can just play at." Clara looked over at him, standing there with his arms crossed. There was something about the way he spoke that made her want to prove him wrong. Instead of backing down, Clara stood taller. She wiped the sweat from her brow and called back, "I'm not playing at anything. I'm here to make this work, and I will." Bart's eyes narrowed as he watched her, but instead of responding, he turned and walked away. Clara could feel the challenge in his words, but it only made her more determined. She wasn't going to let anyone doubt her. She had a ranch to run, and she would do whatever it took to make it succeed. As the days turned into weeks, Clara grew more confident in her role. The animals were thriving, the land was being cared for, and even the barn, once falling apart, was beginning to look like it could be useful again. Clara had a long road ahead, but with every small victory, she could feel herself becoming more and more capable. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the work seemed impossible, when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. But each time those moments came, Clara reminded herself why she was here: to build a life she could be proud of. And no matter how difficult it got, she wasn't about to give up now. The next morning, Clara awoke with a sense of heaviness. The excitement that had filled her just a day before was now replaced with a strange mix of disbelief and sorrow. She had come here with dreams of starting a new life, of marrying James Caldwell and helping him run a ranch. Instead, she was faced with the harsh reality that her future had just been shattered. James, the man she had never met, was gone. She didn't know what to think or how to feel. After a long, restless night, Clara forced herself to get out of bed. She had promised herself she wouldn't back down. There was a strength inside her, a determination she had learned to rely on throughout her life, and it was this strength that now pushed her forward. As she dressed in the simple, dusty clothes she had worn for the journey, she glanced out the window. The sun was rising over the distant hills, casting a golden light over the land. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled her with a sense of peace, despite the sadness that lingered in her heart. Clara made her way to the small church where James's funeral was to take place. As she walked through the town, she couldn't help but notice the quietness of it all. People went about their business, but there was an air of stillness, a sense that something was missing. Clara felt like an outsider in this place, even though she had arrived only the day before. The town, with its wide streets and simple homes, seemed both welcoming and strange to her. It was a place full of possibilities, yet Clara wasn't sure what role she would play in it now that James was gone. When Clara arrived at the church, she was surprised to see a small group of people gathered outside. They were all dressed in black, their faces somber. They looked at her with a mix of curiosity and pity. Clara felt out of place, unsure of what to do or say. She had no connection to James, no real ties to this community, and yet here she was, about to attend a funeral for a man she had never met. Mr. Langley, the neighbor who had greeted Clara the day before, saw her standing awkwardly at the edge of the group. He walked over to her with a kind smile. "You're Clara, aren't you?" he asked gently. Clara nodded, still feeling like a stranger. "Yes, I am. I didn't know James very well," she said quietly, "but I came to be with you all today." Mr. Langley nodded understandingly. James was a good man. He was respected here, and he worked hard for everything he had. We'll miss him. The funeral service itself was simple, just like the people in this small town. There were no grand speeches or elaborate prayers, just a few words of remembrance from those who had known James best. Clara stood silently at the back of the church, her eyes cast downward. She didn't feel like she belonged here, but at the same time she couldn't bring herself to leave. There was something about James's death that tugged at her heart, something she couldn't quite understand. After the service, everyone gathered outside the church. The mood was heavy, and people spoke in hushed tones, sharing memories of the man who had passed. Clara felt like an intruder in the crowd, unsure of how to act or what to say. She had hoped for a chance to meet James, to finally see the man she had been so eager to marry, but instead she was left with only his memory and the feeling that she had come here for nothing. As she stood by the side of the church, lost in her thoughts, Mr. Langley approached her again. This time his expression was more serious. "Clara," he said, "I know this is a difficult time for you, but I want to ask you something. James didn't leave anyone behind. No family, no close friends who could take over the ranch. It's all there, waiting. The cattle, the land, everything. And frankly, I think you might be the best person to take it on." Clara looked up at him, surprised by his words. She had never imagined herself running a ranch, let alone taking over someone else's life's work. She had come here to marry James, not to manage a farm on her own. But as she looked at the ranch with its wide, empty fields and the promise of a future that she couldn't turn away from, something inside her began to shift. "I don't know if I can do it," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never worked on a ranch before. I don't know the first thing about cattle or farming." Mr. Langley smiled gently as if he had expected her hesitation. "I understand. It's a lot to take on. But I've seen the way you carried yourself when you arrived yesterday. You have a fire in you. And honestly, Clara, you're the only one left who has any connection to this place. You could turn things around." Clara's mind raced. The idea of running the ranch was terrifying, but the thought of returning to her old life, to the struggles she had left behind, felt even worse. She had come to the West to start over, to build something new. Maybe this was her chance to do just that, even if it wasn't the life she had expected. "I'll try," Clara said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll give it my best shot." Mr. Langley nodded, clearly relieved. "That's all anyone can ask. You're not alone in this. There are people here who can help if you need it. But it's up to you now." As Clara made her way back to the ranch, her thoughts were a whirlwind of questions and uncertainties. Could she really do this? Could she take on the responsibility of a whole ranch with no experience and no guidance? It seemed impossible, and yet something inside her refused to let go of the idea. She had nothing left to lose, and maybe, just maybe, this could be the fresh start she had been hoping for. That evening, as Clara walked across the vast fields of the ranch, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the land. The view was breathtaking. The open spaces stretched as far as the eye could see, and the quiet beauty of it all made her heart ache. For the first time since arriving, Clara felt a sense of connection to this place. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was real, and it was hers now. As she walked toward the old barn, she made a silent promise to herself. She would do everything she could to make the ranch a success. She would work hard, learn everything she could, and prove that she was capable of more than she had ever believed. She was ready for whatever came next. Clara Grayson had always dreamed of a new life. Born and raised in a small town on the East Coast, she had faced more than her share of hardships. Her childhood hadn't been easy. Her family had struggled with poverty, and as she grew older, things didn't get much better. Clara was determined, though, and believed that there was more to life than the small, confining world she had always known. She longed for a fresh start, a chance to leave the past behind and create something better. One afternoon, while looking through a stack of old newspapers, Clara stumbled upon an advertisement that caught her eye. It was simple but powerful. A rancher in the West was seeking a wife. The ad described a man named James Caldwell, a hard-working rancher who needed a partner to help him manage his land and livestock. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for Clara. She had heard stories about the vast open lands of the West, and she had always imagined that life there could be more fulfilling than the struggle she had known. She couldn't resist. The idea of starting over in a place so different from her life in the East excited her. Without giving it much more thought, Clara wrote a letter to James introducing herself and expressing her interest. She had never met the man, and they had exchanged no more than a few words in their letters, but she felt a strange connection to him. Clara believed that this was the fresh start she had been waiting for. Days turned into weeks, and Clara's excitement grew with each passing day. She received a response from James, written in a steady, confident hand. He was kind in his letter and explained that he had been searching for a wife for some time. James spoke about his ranch, the animals, and the hard, honest work that came with it. He told Clara that he thought she could be the one to make the ranch complete. The thought of moving so far away was a little daunting. Clara had never traveled much before. But the more she thought about it, the more she knew she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. She had no family to hold her back, no real ties to the place where she had grown up. She was free to go, and she felt the pull of the West calling to her. Her journey to the West was long and exhausting. Clara traveled by train, the land around her slowly changing as she moved farther from home. At first she was fascinated by the scenery, the wide open spaces, the vast skies stretching out in all directions. The air felt different, fresher. The further she went, the more she felt a sense of anticipation building inside her. She imagined the ranch that awaited her, a cozy cabin, a hard-working husband, a quiet life on the land. However, the reality of the journey quickly set in. Days and nights blurred together as Clara traveled across the country, passing through unfamiliar towns and empty plains. The people she met along the way were kind but distant, and Clara began to realize just how isolated she would be when she reached her destination. Her thoughts started to wander and doubts crept into her mind. What if James wasn't the man she thought he was? What if life on the ranch was harder than she had imagined? But these thoughts didn't last long. Clara reminded herself that she had made the decision and there was no turning back. She had made a promise to herself to start over, and she wasn't about to let fear or uncertainty stand in her way. Finally, after days of travel, Clara arrived at her destination, a small town nestled in the hills of Wyoming. It wasn't much more than a handful of buildings and a few scattered homes, but Clara could see the beauty and the simplicity of it all. The town was surrounded by vast open land, dotted with ranches and farms. Clara felt a strange sense of peace here, as if she had arrived at the place where she was meant to be. She made her way to the address she had been given, a small ranch just outside the town. As Clara approached the ranch house, she noticed something odd. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was no sign of life, no sounds of animals, no smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of movement anywhere. Clara's heart skipped a beat and she couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. She stepped off the wagon, her boots crunching against the dirt road. Clara glanced around, her nerves starting to get the better of her. Was this the right place? Had she made a mistake? Before she could dwell on these thoughts too long, a man appeared on the porch of the house. He was tall and older, with graying hair and a stern face, but his eyes were kind when he looked at her. Clara felt a slight sense of relief. The man introduced himself as Mr. Langley, a neighbor of James Caldwell. He greeted Clara warmly, though there was a certain sadness in his eyes. He explained that James had passed away recently, just a few weeks earlier. Clara's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had imagined this moment so many times in her mind, but never like this. Mr. Langley went on to explain that James had fallen ill suddenly, and despite the best efforts of the local doctor, he hadn't made it. Clara stood there in shock, unable to process what she was hearing. She had traveled all this way, and now she was faced with the reality that the man she was supposed to marry was gone. The news was devastating, but Clara didn't want to show her emotions. She had come so far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. She had nowhere else to go, and something deep inside her told her that she needed to stay. Mr. Langley invited Clara to the funeral, which was scheduled for the next day. She accepted, feeling a mix of grief and confusion. She couldn't understand how this had happened. How had she arrived just in time for a funeral instead of a wedding? That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Her mind raced as she lay in the small room of a neighbor's house. What was she going to do now? She had made plans for a life she was never going to have, and yet some part of her refused to give up. She couldn't leave without trying to make the most of the opportunity James had offered her. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of the night, wind rustling through the trees, the distant cry of a wolf. She sat up in bed, her eyes wide open in the darkness. A strange feeling washed over her, a mix of fear and excitement. She didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. Her journey had only just begun.